Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Glimmerglass Film Days. I'm Peggy Parsons, and I am here with Gretchen Sorin and Ric Burns, and we're going to talk about Driving While Black, the wonderful film that is still available on our site, on the Glimmerglass Film Days site. We were going to have this discussion last night, and sorry we had to reschedule, but I think you'll soon see the reason for the reschedule, which maybe Ric can tell us, but I hope you all can join us. I hope those of you who were intending to watch last night, I hope you're able to watch it tonight. So let me begin by giving a short introduction of our two guests, and I'll just go in alphabetical order. Ric Burns and Gretchen Sorin made the film together. Ric is a well-known documentary filmmaker. He started a company called Steeplechase Films about 30 years ago. And I've known about Steeplechase this entire time because early on we were showing Ric's work at the National Gallery in Washington, which is my day job. And I was struck by the depth and the complexity and the intelligence with which his films were shot and edited. Ric's company and Ric himself has been nominated for many Emmys. He's won 5 or 6 Emmys, a couple of Peabodys. He won the Eric Barnow Prize from the Organization of American Historians, which I'm sure some of you know who Eric Barnow is. He's a major US historian of broadcast and television. Gretchen Sorin is a very well-known historian. She is the director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program here in Cooperstown, a distinguished professor at the State University of New York. She has authored many books, including Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights, which was the basis for this film. Gretchen is also, she's also organized exhibitions. She's interested in architectural history and has written about, for example, the historic architecture of Harlem. So we're delighted to have you both here. And I'm just going to make a few remarks and then we'll get into the discussion. I think your film is brilliant. And I know that it was made for broadcast, and there's a certain expectation in a film made for broadcast in the way that the film is put together. I mean, there is a formula that works for broadcast, and of course you have to follow that formula. But the quality of the material that you use, the depth of the trajectory, I think it's a beautiful structure for this film, and that I can't say enough about that because I don't watch a lot of public television, but I know most of the time when I see a film on public television, I have an expectation, but this so far exceeded my expectation. I thought it was great. Maybe we can just begin with a very general question, and from you both, maybe you could both tell us your view of the project and how you got into it, and what your relationship has been while making this film. So can one of you just sort of pick up and tell us?
Ric, do you want to start?
Sure. First of all, Anna, thank you so much for these lovely remarks, and I feel thrilled that the film speaks to you. And I will say very briefly before turning it over to Gretchen, because this is Gretchen's project through and through. And it is a fact that she came to me, and I'm incredibly grateful to her, 5 years ago, and sat me down and opened up her laptop at a restaurant on Broadway in 55th Street after we had shared an NEH panel, and said, I want to show you some things about the Green Book and about what America's highways looked like up until the Civil Rights Movement. And it was revelatory, and to see, by the Rotary Club sign coming into any small town north or south, really, to see the KKK sign right by it, to see, this is featured in the film, a proud banner across the main street of Greenville, Texas. Greenville, Texas, it announced to its citizens, anybody who drove through it will see this. Greenville, Texas, the blackest soil, the whitest people. So really inscribed in the most detailed way in a landscape of American culture. And there, as part of the experience of mobility and automobility and the highway, was this remarkable Jim Crow reality. And when we were finished that kind of introduction to this extraordinary work, I just said, Gretchen, let's go, and we started working together. So it's really, Gretchen, thank you for including me in what's this extraordinary work. I do want to just say, two things very, very quickly. One is that I'm sorry that it's now Sunday and not Saturday. Yesterday was a big day in the life of the world. And when the news came out that the election had been decided, I was at 124th Street between Broadway and Claremont, and a roar went up from the crowd. And we looked around, and suddenly it was apparent that it had been decided. And the jubilation and thrill that was general all over New York, and really over so much of the world, was quite extraordinary. And as a sort of a student of New York's history, we've done films on New York, and with a film coming out next year, I took my iPhone and went down the streets and down Broadway past Columbia University to where there was a huge crowd, mainly young, but also people from the neighborhood, plenty of people I knew. Our apartment was 2 blocks away. And while I was furiously iPhoning for our film, which will come out next year, I stupidly tripped over a wall and broke my hand. So when we should have been having this Q&A, Anna, yesterday, I was being sort of, one tiny bone in my wrist was broken, was in New York Presbyterian. So I apologize for the delay, and I'm really grateful to Glimmerglass Film Days.
Oh, we're grateful that it wasn't a worse injury, so you're fine.
You were able to so swiftly accommodate that change. The other thing I just want to say is that, we've been working on this film for a long time, which is sort of characteristic of our style of working. And suddenly 2020 occurred, and events like George Floyd's murder, which had happened, of course, again and again and again and again. What is it, 4,800 lynchings in America, from 1865 until 1966. This kind of the fatal reality of automobility for African Americans is so painful a part of the American experience, but somehow it registered this year. It registered. So after George Floyd's murder and the massive social justice movement that has arisen and is sustained, is the silver lining of one of the most difficult years in American history. And PBS suddenly called us up and said, we really want to broadcast this film in October. And we had a race to the finish line that was unanticipated over the last 3 or 4 months. And, some remarkable Americans who are dear friends of Glimmerglass, and really the reason in more ways than one why we're here tonight, Faith Gay and Francesca Zambello came in and at the last minute made it possible for us to finish our film.
Fantastic.
With their son, Jack McBride. So to Faith and to Francesca and to Jack, I wanted to say thank you so much. We're here because you have made it possible for Glimmerglass to do this extraordinary event, and you made the film possible. So we're doubly in your gratitude. But having said all that, Gretchen, this is really, it's good to see you.
And you as well. It's been a while.
We haven't Zoomed for a few weeks.
We haven't had an opportunity to really get together and celebrate the end of the film. But I think this film, one of the things that, Peg, that you said about the way the film was structured, we really decided early on that we had to go back to the beginning, that this film really looks at the entire sweep of African American history. And one of the things that I've heard from graduate students, I've heard from people that have seen the film, they say it was so unexpected. It was so different than what I thought it was going to be. That's what everybody tells me. But we really decided that you really don't understand mobility. You don't understand how important it is to African Americans unless you think about the time when mobility was denied. And so it goes all the way back to the very beginning. It goes to slavery when mobility was denied. But it also looks at the development at that time period of the very earliest police departments. So
Exactly.
you're seeing that the police departments in early America are formed by slave catchers. They're formed to catch African Americans who are running away from their plantations, or to intimidate people who might run away. So those two things, I think, are key to understanding mobility for African Americans, and that bring us kind of full circle when we think about the relationship today, both between African Americans and law enforcement, and we think about how important mobility is to African Americans. But the coronavirus also kind of gave everyone, not just African Americans, but every American, a little taste of what it means to have your mobility restricted. Just a little bit. And I'm not equating the two, but I think it gave everybody an opportunity to kind of both have a laser focus on the news, like the murder of George Floyd, but also to feel what it was like to have your mobility restricted. And that kind of confluence of things, I think, makes this a moment that's really pivotal, because something can happen. I think people are paying attention now, and it's a time, this film couldn't have been more timely. And it's a time when Black people and white people can actually make something happen, can make some change happen. So right. I hope that's what comes out of.
Absolutely. The timing is incredible. Now, this has already been on PBS, right? I mean, it's been aired. Right, good. And it'll probably come back to PBS.
It will air again. Oh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, when you started talking about the slave patrols, and you kept going back to that point, it suddenly clicked. This whole idea of this knee-jerk reaction that the police have now. I mean, almost as if it's in their DNA. That they somehow managed to inherit this tradition that goes way back to the earliest slave patrol. I mean, it just was mind-blowing. And it's a pattern that somehow has to be changed. I think it is being changed, but it is so deeply rooted. And I think a lot of people just didn't get that, didn't really fully appreciate that, that relationship to the historical aspect until they saw your film.
If you think about the slave patrols, those were legal. Those were legal organizations, legal groups that were going out looking for enslaved people. But after slavery ends, during Jim Crow, the groups that are then going out and intimidating African Americans, many of them still police officers, are extra legal. The Klan. The Klan is going out at night, and they're doing the same thing. They're patrolling, right? They're patrolling train stations. They don't want they don't want to lose their labor force. So they're patrolling train stations to keep people from getting on trains to go north, to leave the South. I mean, it's the same kind of intimidation, but now it's extra legal. Right.
Now yeah, go ahead, Rick. Go ahead.
About this and revelatory is, this is not just a kind of a story in American history. I mean, this is really a very central dynamic in American history. I mean, I think arguably one of the most important dynamics in American history. The idea that race and space and mobility have been unequally distributed. I mean, mobility across space has been unequally distributed in America over time. And, you know, to be sure, it is the kind of the cutting edge of what systemic and structural racism is. And it is linked absolutely to, it's not just a sort of a knee-jerk bigotry, although it is bigotry and racism. It also does come from a profound economic motive. You have to bring, you know, enslaved African Americans were mobilized against their will, basically in a mobile form in the, you know, in the bottom of slave ships, and then forced to work, you know, often in chains, you know, and without leaving a very narrow radius for all their lives. And that circumscribed mobility was key to extracting wealth from their labor. And so after the Civil War as well, the Ku Klux Klan that Gretchen is describing are there to make sure now it's kind of like, okay, we lost the war, but what's the workaround for that? How do we keep this labor force really hemmed in? And sharecropping was a way of hemming them in, reducing their mobility economically through a kind of a lien and loan system, and by the patrols that kept them from moving. And as Craig Wilder, a brilliant historian, puts it in our film, I mean, there is an ingrained suspicion about African Americans moving in American space that is so deeply related to that. And I think one of the great things that history can show us is, as complex and confusing as it is, there are patterns in it which are discernible, and they're not imposed on it. They're there. And once you see them, you can't not see them anymore. And therefore, Driving While Black is rooted in, you know, the Jim Crow experience of African Americans on the road during the era of Jim Crow, which is itself rooted in forms of mobility and immobility before that. And so I think that truth is liberating because it allows us to see the real circumstances that all of us live in, whether we want to or not. And that it is a necessary first step to understanding the world around us, how it got to be that way, and therefore how it might come to be some other way. And at the origin of it, besides slavery, this immobilized population is something which is key to American life, which is William Blackstone, famous English jurist, legal scholar. His commentaries written in the 18th century had a profound impact on the structure of the American Constitution, and the founding of the country defined liberty as locomotion. This is kind of a physics to liberty. You know someone is free. You know you are free if you can self-mobilize.
Right.
So in that context, in which some people can be self-mobilizing, can have the agency to move, and others don't, the automobile, the ultimate self-mobilizing piece of technology, is a crucial intervention in that story. At which point I just go kind of as an amateur historian, student of American history. What an amazing, if also disturbing, kind of continent of American experience is made legible by that. And I think in that respect, Gretchen's work and the work, Gretchen, of your colleagues, this is the golden age of the historiography of this topic, led by Gretchen and a number of other people, Craig Wilder, and many people in our film who are all friends of Gretchen's and who she assembled her cohort.
Yeah, it was an amazing cast that you had assembled for this. I mean, I can't help but comment on that. Everybody had something. I don't know how much you had to cut out, but everything that you left in was so pertinent to the topic. It was really a wonderful assembly of voices. But I wonder if we could shift just for a minute and talk about the Great Migration. Because I had a couple of questions about this, which I'm not sure that I remember what the answers are from the film, but the Great Migration from the South to the North began sometime around 1915-16, right? Which was at the time of the First World War in Europe. And I think, my understanding of the Great Migration is that these factories and plants in the North were not getting the immigrant communities because of the war going on in Europe, right? So they needed workers. They needed workers And so it was a wonderful time for Black Americans in the South to go north and to get jobs. But how would you characterize that mobility? I mean, were they leaving the South on trains? Were they packing trains, or what? You know,
They were leaving the South in any way that they could. They were using trains, they were using buses, they were using private cars when they
so they were using cars when they could.
When they could, right. And if someone, you know, the Black newspapers in the North, particularly the Chicago Defender, would advertise, you know, come on up north. And people were writing to the Chicago Defender saying, can I get a job? And the Chicago Defender was encouraging people to leave. And they were leaving in any way that they could. And they were putting every bit of personal goods, anything that they had, strapping it to these automobiles. But if one person left, they might come back and take 5 or 6 more people with them. But people were also taking trains, and they were taking buses to whatever locations they could. I think the Great Migration is really key to this story, because it enables people to be able to purchase cars. It enables people to have disposable income. And it's also important that African Americans are able to work in the automobile industry.
Right.
Henry Ford is one of the few people, you know, Henry Ford was a raging anti-Semite. So American Jews were not buying Fords, but Ford was willing to hire African Americans, often in the most horrible jobs. I mean, they were dangerous, hot, horrible jobs, but they were jobs, and they paid decently, and African Americans were able to move up in social class and were able to purchase luxury goods like an automobile. And they would take those automobiles back to the South, and they would bring other people out of the South as well. So, you know, that it facilitated that movement, both in social class, and also facilitated the movement of other family members into the North and the West. People also West.
And that is the greatest migration of people in American history.
Right.
I mean, 6 to 7 million African Americans who, you know, impelled by circumstances, economic circumstances, and segregated circumstances in the South by lynchings. You know, you know, they flooded north, and it was a part of, in a sense, 20th century America was shaped by the self-mobilization of African Americans across that period from 1916 to 1970.
So during that, or let's say during the early years of the Great Migration, was there a concerted effort to stop this flow of people out of the South? I mean, what was done? What was done to prevent their mobility, you know, north?
The same, you know, the vigilante groups were out. They were patrolling train stations and bus stations. People were leaving under cover of darkness because they didn't want to lose the southern whites didn't want to lose their labor force. So yes, they were doing all kinds of things to prevent.
So it was very risky to get on board a train.
Absolutely.
And once you're in the train, it's incredible. We cite this amazing Langston Hughes poem. You know, I pick up my life and put it on a train, and go everywhere, north, west, but not south. Yeah. So the sense of self-mobilization to move towards, to use mobility to move towards an area of the country where self-enfranchisement through better jobs would be possible. I mean, it's extraordinary. And indeed made the automobile industry what it was. And GM picked it up after Ford did it. So it became, a kind of, in that respect, an inadvertent virtuous circle that Henry Ford, the bigot, the anti-Semite, started, because then it became, even though the jobs were terrible, they paid essentially, I think it was 95 cents on the dollar. Henry Ford paid African-American workers $5 an hour, just the way he paid white American workers. That was profound. And he may not have been doing it for any particularly liberating motive, but the impact was in fact liberating, partially, although the circumstances up north was another form of Jim Crow era segregation in so many ways. The jobs were segregated, the work was segregated, the living circumstances were segregated across the North. It just was, the signs weren't up, the KKK signs weren't up. But, where I grew up in Newark, Delaware until I was 8, the African Americans in Newark, Delaware between 1955 and 1965 lived invariably, literally on the other side of the tracks.
Right. But you also talk, there's a lot of the film talks about this concept of the parallel world that was established. And I found that fascinating because I remember that as well. I can remember, having lived in Washington, D.C. all these years, there are remnants of that. You can see the remnants as you're driving around. So let's talk about that a little bit, because you also later on in the film, you point out that it was transportation that really decimated this parallel world too, because when the interstates came in and all of these road arterials were established, it was the neighborhoods of the Black entrepreneurs and the wonderful lively businesses that were set up in this parallel world that were destroyed. So talk about that a little bit, if you would. It's a very interesting part of the film. It of course, it encapsulates the whole notion of segregation, but there were extremely successful businessmen.
And if you think about the way that the businesses that were needed when African Americans start to travel, right? You're prohibited from staying at hotels, you're prohibited from staying at motels, and your restaurants, you can't go to restaurants, gas stations, you need these services if you're going to travel across the country. And so African Americans built these businesses that served only African Americans, and they were in urban areas throughout the United States, areas where there was a large concentration of African Americans. You didn't find a lot of them. You didn't find a lot of them I have a visitor here. You didn't find a lot of them in places where there were not a lot of African Americans. Right. But you did, Nemo, please. But you did find total parallel cities almost.
Yeah.
The white Americans were really unaware of. And
I found it, I didn't know, for example, that Ellis Marsalis Sr. had this flourishing business, a restaurant.
Marsalis Motel.
Yes, I didn't know anything about that. We know the Marsalis name, of course, because of the great musicians, but I really didn't know about the patriarch, and that he actually became wealthy. Didn't he become wealthy because of this, right?
Absolutely. What was remarkable is that in this completely divided American world, the flourishing of these extraordinary creative entrepreneurial activities, whether they were restaurants or motels or barbershops. It was really, and then the method to know where they were through the Negro Motorist Green Guide, Victor and Alma Green's guide to let you know, here's where you could go. And the life, the most joyous aspect of this, for anybody who doesn't, including me, who doesn't or didn't know about this, is to see into this world in which there are these places, the Dewdrop Inn, Ducky Chase in New Orleans, the Marsalis Motel, where everybody who was anybody went to these places.
Right.
And extraordinary, often, women often ran the boarding houses or ran the places where there were rooms or restaurants. And it became another kind of virtuous cycle in which, the more people understood about it, it more became known. And so it really flourished from the 30s and 40s and 50s to the 60s. With Gretchen, maybe you want to talk about
and I think the travel guides gave these businesses national publicity. They would never have been able to afford the kind of marketing that they got as a result of these travel guides. So the travel guides really provided not only the service of, helping you locate a place that would be welcoming, but they also provided marketing for these small mom and pop businesses that existed all over the country that wouldn't be able to, you know, if you were in New Jersey, you wouldn't be able to afford to market to someone from California or someone from even Pennsylvania. You know, you had this national advertising brochure basically in these guides. In these
Right, and there was a lot more than the Green Book. I mean,
Oh,
we know the Green Book because, you know, it was sort of popularized a few years ago with a movie, and I mean, I can sort of almost remember seeing Green Book in the Esso stations. Weren't they available in the Esso station? Yeah.
yes.
When I was a kid, I mean, Esso was like everywhere, and I have this recollection of actually seeing them in Esso stations when we were
Wow.
vacationing in the South. But there were so many more, and so one question that I had as I was watching the film, you know, your reliance on these was so significant if you were traveling, but was the information always correct? Could you always count on, you know, I mean, in other words, if there's a mistake, you know, if a place has gone out of business, or if the wrong address is given or something like that, it could be devastating because you wouldn't, as a family, you wouldn't be able to find the place.
But
So,
that's
I mean,
how the Green Book and all of the travel guides always said, make your reservations in advance, plan your trip.
so you would have to write. I mean, would you call or would you write?
Right. You would write.
You would write, yeah.
Yes. And actually the Rock Rest, which is in Kittery, Maine, they have a manuscript. There's a manuscript collection associated with that tourist home, and they have the letters of people writing, Mrs. Smith would like to stay for 2 weeks. Do you have space? People would write letters and looking for you know, rooms often. And there's also a W.E.B. Du Bois would write, often wrote to Washington, D.C. looking for a place to stay in Washington. So people wrote letters.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating for us now because we're so, you know, we're so attuned to getting instant messages, you know, but here you'd have to write probably months in advance.
Yes.
You'd have to plan out your trip, write a letter, wait for the return, right? I mean, because you'd have to get a letter back
Right.
from the place to make sure that they got your letter. I mean, you know, you really the whole timeline was so vastly different. And
You know, I found just to that point, Spencer Cruz, one of our colleagues who was extraordinary in the film, amazing curator at the Smithsonian. Spencer Cruz talks about something he calls travel craft, which is special knowledge that African Americans, Black Americans have had to have of how you navigate this landscape, what you need to think about in advance. And that becomes itself revelatory about the degree of, to resist the immobilizing circumstances of American life, you have to work and think and plan in advance in a very, don't go here, go there, right in advance. Make sure make sure that you have all the things in the trunk of your car so that you can get through Chattanooga, which may not be a particularly friendly place. So there's this profound sense of the complicated and not in any way hospitable geography of the American landscape,
right,
which is totally unknown to white Americans.
Right, I know. I mean, we used to. Sometimes
like we have no idea what's really going on.
Right.
And other group of Americans are moving through the same site and have to plan and work around the obstacles and, frankly, the lethal obstacles, because it was extremely dangerous to be found, late at night on the road in places where you didn't want to, where you were not wanted to be.
Right, so which leads me to wonder, I mean, since it was so dangerous and you had to be so meticulous in the planning, was there a payoff? I mean, was it really worth it to have to go through all of that just to see a relative or, go to one of these resorts? I mean, because
when you say that, though, I think that was the only method African Americans knew. It wasn't as if they knew anything different. If you wanted to see your family, that's what you did. That's how you had to navigate the country to be safe.
Right, and of course you would want to see your family because they're your family, and you really have to keep up those connections. So you've got to do it. But then, there are all these wonderful resorts as well, which sort of sounds like a lot of people were traveling, not so much to see family, but to go to these places where they could have a good time.
The other thing, not only a good time, but to get away from the day-to-day racism that they faced. So, and one of the things that folks talk about is how painful it was day to day to have to face the kind of racism that they faced every day in America, and how going to a resort was an opportunity to be with other people who were welcoming and friendly. It was a way for people to introduce their children to marriage partners. It was a way for them to just have that kind of relaxation that everybody was talking about yesterday. The burden has been removed from your shoulders, and you can just relax and be yourself and not have to worry about the racism.
Right. So it's worth it to get on the road and to have to endure what is probably going to be a scary journey to some extent.
Right.
But it's worth it because you're able to finally have a vacation from.
And many of these, and people stayed for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's not as if they were going just overnight or 2 nights. They were staying for a week or 2.
Yeah, like Idlewild. I love
right.
the footage.
Idlewild, American Beach.
Yeah.
Val Verde in California, Oak Bluffs.
Yeah.
Martha's Vineyard.
Gretchen, this is a national experience. It grows and grows across the first half of the 20th century, as this extraordinary kind of culture of African American entrepreneurship sort of really creatively rises. And so it really is. I mean, Winks Lodge, in the foothills of the Rockies, or it just places that are completely unknown to most of us now, and certainly to white Americans, where, the Black community in the 5 Points of Denver, and places where you could get out and, go skiing or, spend some time, in the snow of the Rockies. So that, it was a way of availing, of opening up the wonders of the American landscape to African Americans. And in that
how many places like this exist now? I mean, physically exist, either as sites of historic preservation or as ongoing resorts that are now open to anyone. I mean, is it are they all gone, or can you find remnants, and do some places exist?
The estimation is that there are only 3% of the sites that are in the Green Book, that are and which are many of the same sites that are in most of the travel guides are the same. So less than 3%. And a lot of that has to do with urban renewal. And it also has to do with the growth of African Americans staying at mainstream hotels.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But the photographs and the footage you had was so compelling that you just sort of want to see if anything still exists, physically. I mean, if the physical place is there.
Is that, the automobile is, a unsung hero of the civil rights movement. How do you get around? How do you mobilize African American civil rights leaders and workers and their white civil rights, allies and accomplices? They're not. The automobile was crucial to that, and so you could get from A to B. You could get out of dangerous situations where obviously not everyone got out of those dangerous situations alive. And therefore the role, and this is a key part of, I think, of Gretchen's work, and therefore of the film, is the role that the automobile played in advancing the mobility, literal and metaphorical, that came along with the civil rights movement, with the tremendously complicated consequence that once the legislation made it illegal to say you cannot have coffee at the same counter, you cannot keep somebody out of this hotel or motel, then it had a tremendously adverse effect on these Black businesses, because African Americans could now go everywhere. Not all of a sudden and all at once, but increasingly so, starting in the late 1960s. And white Americans did not then avail themselves reciprocally the extraordinary wonders of the Black establishments, but it was simply impossible for these establishments. It was partly urban renewal, but impossible for these establishments to make it work. The margins weren't there any longer to make these businesses work. And so it shrank and shrank and shrank until down by the 1980s, so many of these businesses had been forced out of businesses. And there's still Ducky Chase in New Orleans and a few places which are legendary, but there are very, very few. And I find that, you know,
Chili Bowl in DC, Peggy, you probably are familiar.
Oh yeah.
Ben's Chili Bowl in DC.
Yeah, of course. I know. That's yeah. I mean,
That's one of the places that's still standing.
Right, and it's doing very well. I mean, it keeps having new populations come in. Yeah, I mean, you also bring up, I mean, brilliantly in the film, sort of toward the end, maybe, I don't remember exactly when it first comes up, but talking about the civil rights movement in terms of transportation and, you know, the Montgomery bus boycott and all of that. I mean, in many ways, the whole history of the civil rights movement can be charted in terms of transportation.
Absolutely.
And, you know, that's part of this interesting structure of the film that I found so amazing.
Homer Plessy, you know, is from New Orleans, and the most infamous law after Dred Scott was the Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision of 1896. And, you know, activists in New Orleans said, you know what, we're going to test these newly segregative laws that say that black people can't go on the streetcars in New Orleans, and we'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided against Homer Plessy in this legendary law. It basically locked in segregation for the next 6 decades in American life. So it is always, in some sense, you know, if somebody once said it's the economy stupid, it's all about transportation and mobility, always on buses, through automobiles, on trains, etc. And then also just mobility through, you know, through rising and better jobs. Every aspect of mobility is part of the story with the transportation system central to it.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the time, and I wonder if Caroline, can you tell us if questions are coming in, or is there something we could direct now to, you know, questions from the audience?
Sure, we've had several questions come in from the audience. The first one, someone's curious to learn about the personal and family home videos that were part of this documentary, and how you came to find so much of that footage.
Yeah, it's great archival footage and great archival photography. I know some of it is personal for Gretchen, but yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because it's very rich with footage and photography.
You know, I want to say that my single favorite part of the film is a color home movie of a very little girl, first seen, you know, outside with the keys, opening up the driver's very extremely exasperated that she cannot get in at first, and then manages to get in, gets in, and there she is with the door open. She's in the front of me. I mean, she must be all of 4, 3. And I just want everyone to know that's Gretchen.
My father was a photographer, and he always had a camera or a film camera, and that was a piece of film that we found. I had the home movies, and when we started looking for home movies, I brought them to Steeplechase and said, you know, here, let's see what's on these, and it was the perfect. And it's a great interior of a Studebaker.
Oh, it's so beautiful. And Gretchen's determination. This is a girl who is not going to be kept out of that car. She is going someplace.
I wish I still had that car. It's a great car.
Yeah, so you have so much footage. I mean, you must have combed the archives, or where is it from? Is it from a particular collection, most of it, or, I mean, besides your personal stuff?
Well, it's from, we had some great producers, young producers working with us on this film, and they combed archives, and at the Smithsonian has the new African American Museum has an archive. But what's, I think, interesting about this film is that it is national in scope. And so we had to go all over the place. So many, historical stories, you get to kind of focus in on, one city or one community. And for this, we had to go all over the country because it really is a national story. And it was important.
Couldn't go everywhere. And so we really had to make decisions as to what places we would choose. And it turned out to be, of course, those places where the issues of race, space, and mobility were particularly concentrated in very telling ways. So New Orleans, which is almost the Genesis city, this extraordinary transportation hub there at the foot of the Mississippi. Detroit, the automobile. Los Angeles, the highway. And across the country, we chose those places where the themes of the story were expressed and revealed, not always in repetitive ways, but in new ways so you could understand them and see them. But that it is a national story there's no place in the country where you can't find aspects of this story across
And the images are from all over the place.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that was clear. I mean, that was one of the beauties of the film, I think. So Caroline, do you have another question for us?
Sure, we have a couple more. Another viewer is curious to learn if there are any plans in the works for this to be shown on TV beyond PBS.
Yes, there are. Well, it will definitely be streamed. I'm really pleased to say that it will be.
What about a theatrical? What about a theatrical?
I'd really love to do that, and I think that it could happen. Normally broadcast is death to theatrical releases, but 2020 and coronavirus, which has turned everything on its head in every respect, has also done that for film and TV. And I think that it really could have a limited theatrical release. It's also going to be rebroadcast in Black History Month in February. And there's also what's in the process, in the works, is the Mellon Foundation. The Andrew Mellon Foundation has funded a really fantastic outreach and public engagement and educational campaign, which was initially going to not just be virtual, but also bricks and mortars and panels and events, now is being sort of retrofitted to the virtual circumstances required by COVID. And that'll be happening across 2021.
Right.
So
well, as you know, a lot of theaters now are doing their virtual theaters. And, I was just thinking of a place like Film Forum in New York, which has a very interesting repertory lineup. And I mean, you could see the film by buying a ticket to Film Forum. In other words, Film Forum could put it on their website and advertise it,
right.
And then you can get a virtual ticket that way. I mean, it seems like a natural thing that could happen that way. But
I hope it's true to say that people would really be. I mean, I found this history revelatory. I mean, and painful as it is, hopeful. The truth is hard, but it's clean. And as I was saying before, it allows you to see the possibility of change. And we're at one of those very special inflection points in American history. They don't come around. You can't choose them. They choose you. Right. And we have been chosen in the last year. And it's clear that we're not in Kansas anymore with respect to some aspects of the social justice movement. And I very much hope that this kind of continues to build and roll, and everything, every component of anything that's eye-opening and revelatory and motivating is part of that. I mean, Gretchen, as you always said, the point of this history is to spur change. Yeah.
But it's such a story of American history. It's a story that everybody needs to know. It just reveals so much about our country and our character and how we've developed over the years. I think that it absolutely has to be seen.
And I think we have a love affair with the automobile, and always have. And American historians have looked at the automobile, but they've never really looked past that kind of celebratory idea about the American automobile and American mobility, to think about how that mobility might be different for African Americans.
Right, exactly.
And I think, I was kind of surprised at that when I first started digging into this, but it makes sense that we've just ignored. I mean, I don't think it doesn't make sense in a good way, but I understand why. It's a very painful story.
Right. It is very painful. I mean, it's sort of contrary to what advertisers want you to know too. I mean, when you see car ads,
Totally.
yeah.
And advertisers for Cadillac and for certain luxury cars did not want their automobiles to be associated with African Americans. And many Cadillac dealerships wouldn't even sell their cars to African Americans because they thought it wasn't good for their image. So African Americans were totally ignored when it came to automobile advertising until the 1970s. You didn't see African Americans in automobile advertisements.
Gretchen, I do want to say that, and this is another theme that kind of runs through the whole history of automobility and this experience, which is that we're currently in conversations, and I don't mean to in any way jeopardize them by saying this right now. We're in conversations with a major American car manufacturer who saw the film and reached out to us. And we would like to talk to you about coming in and sponsoring the film as it goes forward in its various afterlives, which is very much, Standard Oil, for example, just as the Ford Motor Company helped make mobility possible in certain ways for African workers in Detroit and other places, in the teens and 20s. And just as Standard Oil saw what Victor Green was doing, and while there are other, gas stations, gas companies, oil companies, which would not open their businesses to blacks, Standard Oil said, wait a minute, this is an unexploited market. And the reason why we know the Green Guide but don't know the Go Guide or don't know some of the other ones as well is because Victor Green's success, the Negro Motors Green Guide, was because Standard Oil essentially said, we'll put this in, as you said, Peggy, in every one of our gas stations. So suddenly Victor Green had a major outlet for his thing. So that helped build and roll the Negro Motors Green Guide. And what's interesting is that we're finding a kind of a shadow of that now, in that a major car manufacturer sees this as something which is so crucial to understanding automobility in America. And what's difficult, on the contrary, not shrinking from what's difficult at all. We didn't approach them. They approached us, which I find, heartening. And I know that it's, who knows if it'll actually happen, but it's striking that there's a sense that this is part of the territory that automobile, and it could be any major American automobile. It's one of the big ones. So I have to say, I was really thrilled to hear that. We're in the middle of conversations, and if it happens, it'll really help underwrite a lot of the rollout of the film, across 2021. So we'll see what happens with that. So it's
that's great.
It's a little bit the way American Express, in a way, Coca-Cola have picked up on Black Lives Matter. And one can be cynical about doing that, but frankly, when you go into Times Square, and there at the northern end of Times Square is where the Coke sign is a Black Lives Matter sign, I say, I'm down with that. That's fantastic, because it's now giving that a kind of like a national brand, is now branding it nationally.
Right. Well, we know that's what it takes. You got to have that. I mean, if you're gonna break these.
Question of automobility, mobile, national in a very big way.
Yeah. So we have a couple more minutes. Caroline, is there anything else we should consider? Questions?
Sure. Here's another one. A viewer is curious to learn about the process of making a documentary. For example, how many hours of interviews did one film, and how to decide what to keep and what to cut.
Yeah. So Gretchen came to us and opened up a whole world of, it's kind of a filmmaker's dream. Here's this brilliant scholar doing this work, which she's been doing on for weeks. She's got this extraordinary point of departure. She also has the research, and it's not just the stories, which it is. It's also the so much of the image material, the graphic material, the photographs, the home movies. It's also the cohort of scholars who she brought with it as well. And we interviewed we interviewed 27 people, 22 of them are African-American, four white American. across the entire range of automobility. And each one is fantastic. You know, Gretchen is sort of first among equals, as someone said about Alexander Hamilton and the founding fathers. But, you know, it's an amazing cohort of people. And talking about the highway, and talking about, you know, Detroit, and talking about aspects of the Green Book, Gretchen. And, you know, you sit down and you have this amazing, you have conversations with these amazing people, which is basically means that doing the kind of filmmaking that my brother helped me get involved with allows you to be a college student for the rest of your life, moving from course to course. You know, you spend 5 years studying with Gretchen Sorin and her race, space, and mobility in America. And then what stops it from being an encyclopedic mess and sprawl is the fact that film is a narrative medium. Yeah. And you cannot resist that. You may not want that to be the case. I love that fact that it's the case, but what happens is that the narrative discipline means it has to be moving someplace. It has to be moving through a story. And that story, if you get it right, ends up selecting what material to use. And at a certain point, and any filmmaker knows this, the film begins to tell you what to use. So you may know you have 13 different things about aspects of automobility in the 1930s or 1920s in car plants, but these are the ones that are going to advance your story. And there's a remarkable quote that we found from Thurgood Marshall. It's incredible. It's 1938, and he's a young lawyer, and he's standing on the platform of the train station in Baton Rouge, and a white man with a gun comes up to him, and you don't know it's Thurgood Marshall, and says, using the N-word, "Hey boy, what are you doing here?" And the writer says, "Well, I'm waiting for the train to Shreveport, Louisiana." And this white man says, "Well, the last train comes through here about 4 o'clock, and you better be on it, because the sun ain't never set on a live nigger in this town." Thurgood Marshall, 1938. Bam! It's revelatory material. And so you know, when you understand that in 1938, as late as that standing as a professional on his way up, Supreme Court, Associate Justice, to be Thurgood Marshall, is accosted by a white man with a gun, who patronizes him with the worst language imaginable in American life, and essentially threatens his life if he's not on the next train out of town. That's astonishing. And that becomes that's the last thing you hear before you join the Great Migration, because you understand being in Baton Rouge on that train station platform is not a place you want to be. You want to be someplace else. And then the Great Migration begins. And so that narrative impulse, which drives all film, is what you have to then submit the archival material and the interviews to. And at the end of the day, it's not, I say, it tells you what to do. It's a sweaty process, a lot like making sausage. But, at the end of the day, if you can listen to what the film wants it to be, once you have to make of it, you'll find the way through. And if you have someone like Gretchen, who's there at the beginning and there at the end to keep you on the rails, you're never going to go wrong.
And we spent a lot of days in a dark room, just looking at interviews, looking at photographs, and saying, we have to use that. We have to use that when we can't use that. Really thinking about what are the key moments that absolutely have to be in the film, and what, and also I think Amir Lewis, who was the film editor, he had some really interesting insight, because he came to the film relatively late in the process. But there were things that grabbed him. We had been looking at it, but there were things that were so emotional that they tugged at his heart. And we said, yeah, those have to be in the film.
But at the same time, there are always, and I think this is part of the filmmaking process as well, that helps select in and out. Mm-hmm. The metaphorical post-it on our editing machine was, it's about race, space, and mobility, students.
Right.
This is the core. So here's this very abstract subtitle to our film, but it's the key to the film. Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America. And if you follow that thread from, say, 1619, when the first slave ship gets to Jamestown, down through the latest event that takes place hideously as African-American is manhandled by the police in 2021 or 2020 in our film, what you see is that it's always about race, space, and mobility, and that there is an inner story there. So it comes from, you know, the having with the guidance of Gretchen and her colleagues, being shown what's at stake, race, space, and mobility, then having this amazing footage and the commentary on it. There's no narration in this film. There's no third person narrator. This film is constructed out of what the 27 men and women who we interviewed have to say about it, plus a handful of voices: James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Alfred Edgar Smith, and a few W.E.B. Du Bois, who's writing on this subject is extraordinary and revelatory. And that's then how the film takes shape. And then you have to like.
And speaking of extraordinary voices, I just found out, I guess yesterday, that one of your loveliest, most interesting people, Leah Chase.
Yes.
Recently passed, and
Yes.
I was very saddened to hear that. I loved her in the film. I thought she contributed so much. Leah, she's she's not the founder of Dookie Chase, but she's the what is her relationship? She's the matriarch.
Yes, yeah. So she was there at the beginning, at the origin. And
Yeah,
yeah. Who
extraordinary woman. I mean, but like everybody in the film, everybody played a major part. It was hard to say, that so and so contributed more to that. There was just so much richness and texture to this film. So we're going to have to wrap it up because it's time to go. But I wanted to thank you both so much. This was a wonderful discussion, and I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else learned a lot too. And if you haven't seen the film yet, it's still good for another day, I think another 24 hours. So do see it and encourage your friends to see it, to buy tickets to it. It's America. I mean, this is America, and you have to understand the contents of this film. So anyway, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Film Days. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.